Deuteronomic history, and the role of the redactor in the Old Testament historical books. When we think of the modern scholarship and the Old Testament, the documentary hypothesis comes immediately to mind. Originally proposed by Julius Wellhausen, this idea suggests that there is evidence that the Pentateuch was compiled from various sources. Wellhausen theorized that there were four such sources: the Yahwist, the Elohist, the Deuteronomist, and the priestly. We have come to know these sources as J, E, D, and P, and they're dated from about the mid 9th century BCE all the way down to the 5th century BCE, depending on what source you're speaking about. The sources were joined together at various points in time by a series of editors or redactors. When we speak of redactors, redaction criticism comes to mind. Redaction criticism theorizes about the work of the redactors or the editors in biblical narratives. Scholars read narratives looking for repetitions, additions, subtractions, summaries, moralizations, etc., to arrive at what they claim to be the redactor's interests. For instance, we have a problem in the book of 1 Samuel where we see that at one point David knew Saul because he used to go to Saul's palace to play for him the harp when Saul was in a foul mood or he was low. Yet still, when we look at the story of David and Goliath, after David kills Goliath, Saul is inquiring as to who this youngster is. How do you account for the traditions, the different traditions? Well, many people believe that the contradiction is evidence of two oral traditions coming together, being brought together, being stitched together by the redactor, and in not so much of a very smooth way. The differences are not ironed out. As to why that is so, we are not certain. Sometimes also the redactors look at a repeated line, like for instance a line in Judges, that prepares us in that case for the redactor's interest in the coming Davidic monarchy. And that line says, "In that day there was no king in the land, and the people did what was right in their own eyes." The period of the judges is a period of chaos, is a period of apostasy repeatedly, and what the redactor was doing was preparing the way for the coming of the Davidic monarchy. So Deuteronomistic history then is concerned with the telling of the story of Israel from the time of Deuteronomy through to 2 Kings. Martin North theorized that there is evidence of a Deuteronomist at work. His was the original theory, and the Deuteronomist was retelling the story of Israel centuries after the purported events that these books were said to have recorded. Okay? North believed that the books were written just before or during the Babylonian exile. So, if we take North's theory seriously, then we'll see that Deuteronomistic history is talking about one book of the Bible, so to speak, or one of the one library in the libraries found in the Bible. Let me explain. Deuteronomistic history is speaking of this one book because it covers the history of Israel from Deuteronomy to 2 King. It treats all of these as one extended story being told for particular purposes. It is speaking about the period of history where Judah is defeated and is carried off into Babylonian exile. Look at that chart and you will see that the period of time that he's talking about, but it's a part of the preparation period. There are three preparation periods in the history of Israel according to this theory, and Judah's defeat and Babylonian exile is one of preparation for their return to Jerusalem, okay, and so on. Another way of looking at this is to see it on Israel's timeline, and you see when you're talking about the period of the Babylonian exile of Judah. Now, what is the major concern? And the major concern is this: how do we explain the tragedy of the exile? How can we explain the tragedy of the exile? You see, the exile pose various very difficult questions for the Israelites to answer. And then we could say that there are questions that they're asking of God. For instance, has God chosen to break his everlasting promise to Israel, to give them the land, to give us the land, and to be ruled by the house of David? We see those as scriptural promises that were right there. And now they're seeing that being broken, or they're wondering if it's being broken. Is God untrustworthy then? And so, is he really worthy of honor and worship? Is our God not as strong as the gods of the other nations? And if so, should we switch our allegiance to their more powerful gods? These are the questions that are they are in the minds of the Israelites as they find themselves in the Babylonian exile. So the exile is a way of Israel to deal with their theodicy, that is, the problem of evil in the world in the light of a good God. So here goes. They believed that God was all powerful, or so they thought. They thought that God was all good also. But they found that terrible things were happening to them in the world. In this case, they were caught up in the brutal Babylonian exile. So the Deuteronomistic historian has a solution to this problem. One, the exile is a punishment or correction for humanity's infidelity to God's work. And some say that the Deuteronomist's emotional God allows for allows space for a more capricious God, so to speak. We have a more human God who is capricious and given to these frailties. Those that comes from scholars who are very critical of the history of Israel. And I want to suggest to you that though some people say that this is what the Deuteronomistic history does, it is not necessarily so that the Deuteronomistic historian is trying to show. He's not trying to show God as being petty or capricious in any way. Now, the Deuteronomistic history, or the idea of the Deuteronomistic history, brings to us a lot of questions regarding how we should group the books. The books are listed there from Genesis down to Second Kings, and in the traditional way, we group them as the first 5 books of Moses. In the Hebrew text, it's called the Torah. In the Greek text or the English Bible, it's called the Pentateuch, 5 books. Then we have from Joshua down to Second Kings, which make up the former prophets in the Hebrew Bible, or we call them the historical books in the English Bible. However, with these new ways of thinking that came up with the Deuteronomist kind of history thesis, there are some scholars who start to see things a little bit differently. For instance, Von Rad, the great Old Testament scholar, theorized that we shouldn't have a Pentateuch, we should have a Hextateuch, the first 6 books, that is Genesis to Deuteronomy and Joshua, because Joshua feels so much like a continuation of Deuteronomy, okay, as though it really should have belonged with the first 6 books, the other 5 books of the Bible, the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, when Noth came, Nath came up with this Deuteronomistic history in which he sees from Deuteronomy down to Second Kings as one book, really, one concern, held together by the theories that were first purported in the book of Deuteronomy. So there are different ways in which you could kind of, what we say, shelve or group the books of the Pentateuch and the other historical books. Let's look a little bit more about Knott's Deuteronomistic history theory. He developed the theory first and it became very popular with scholars for a period of time. And the basic idea, as I've mentioned before, is that a redactor or an editor put together various materials from the past to address the needs of the people during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century. So one of the scholars who supported Knott's theory was Moshe Weinfeld. Weinfeld saw within this Deuteronomistic history 10 themes that were prevalent throughout the work. One, he saw the struggle against idolatry. Israel constantly struggled with this thing of faithfulness to their God. We saw the idea of one centralized cult, or that there was this constant effort to wipe away all extraneous worship. In keeping with the struggle against idolatry, Israel wanted to recreate one religious order throughout. Then we see the theme of election, exodus, and conquest throughout. We see those things. The people of Israel are elect. We see them constantly being delivered from the hands of their enemies, and they are conquering enemies throughout. Then we see the monotheistic ideal, again going back to the idea of the worship of Israel, the struggle against idolatry, one centralized cult, the idea that Israel's God is not just the best God or the greatest God, he's the only God. We see that developing throughout the Deuteronomistic history. We see the observance of the law as being of paramount importance to the idea of faithfulness to God. And then we see the inheritance of the land. Israel are promised the land. The land belongs to theirs, and they can go through the land and they can purge the land for their own use. We see the development of this reward or retribution or the blessing curse ideal. You do well, you'll be blessed or rewarded. You do evil, then you face retribution or curses. We see the idea of the fulfillment of prophecy constantly being expounded in this part of the history of Israel. The most important prophecy being that of the coming of David and David's line, which is the election of David and his dynasty. Then comes the fulfillment of that prophecy. And importantly, we see a distrust of anything foreign. This last point is of great importance to me, at least, since what comes next is often shrouded in this thing of the foreign that we very often overlook. Okay, but we're going to see that shortly when we come to look at Saul. Now, there were revisions of Knott's theory, first by Frank Moorcross and then by Rudolf Smend. So Frank Moorcross, he said that the first edition of the Deuteronomistic history was written during the reign of Josiah, 640 to 608 BCE, and they were to support his religious reforms. You remember that story where Josiah's the priests find the book of the law in the house of God, and Josiah uses it for his religious reform, and he purges Israel of their idolatrous practices. He goes on to say that there's a second edition or revisions written during the Babylonian exile about 550 BC, okay, to account for what went wrong with God's promise to Israel. Rudolf Smend then also supported the theory but added a little bit of a revision. He says the first edition was written during the exile, but this was a much briefer account, which was then given to extensive post-exilic expansions due to a new theological interest resulted in the multi-book library that we now know today as a Deuteronomistic history. The idea here is that the exile gives the Israelites new theological insight, and so they are revising their story as they move forward. So, what were the materials used to write this Deuteronomistic history from Deuteronomy to Second Kings? Well, diverse materials of hero tales, tribal traditions, royal records, and like. They were combined to reflect an ideological or theological vision of Israel's and Judah's history that accounts for the exile. So what happened is that there are editorial sections tie the original divergent material together to form a literary unit. And sometimes these are not done so well, as we mentioned with the story of David and Saul. So let's look at each book in the series. So the first of the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomion means second or repeated law. The question is, why is Moses repeating the law? Traditionally, we are saying that Moses repeats the law when the people are going into the promised land. Just on the threshold of going into the land, Deuteronomic historians are saying that this is a re-recording of the law to update the law, especially as Deuteronomist writes from the standpoint of Israel's history. The theme of the book is God makes a treaty with Israel in which obedience brings blessing and disobedience brings chaos. Next book in the series is the book of Joshua. Yahweh leads Israel conquest of Canaan through this book. And that conquest is only thwarted by the unfaithfulness of Israel towards Yahweh. It's the only thing that stops God from accomplishing his purpose. It is Yahweh's cause, it is Yahweh's fight, it is Yahweh's victory. Yet still Israel fails to obey, and so they put a stone in the spoke of God's plan. And there are three stages to this victory throughout the book of Joshua. We see the victory in the central highlands, victory in southern Canaan, and then victory in northern Canaan. Very important in the book of Joshua, and it kind of gives an overview of the whole book, is the story of Jericho. Remember that story? The siege of Jericho is depicted as a ritual act, and the children of Israel march around ritualistically around Jericho 7 times, once per day for 6 days. On the 7th day, they walk around 7 times, and with a shout, the walls come tumbling down. What is interesting in this story is the concept of a harem is shown. That is, the people and the animals of Jericho are dedicated as an offering to God. They are to be utterly destroyed. And you can see that in other passages in the book of Joshua. Now, important to the story is that one soldier, his name is Achan, he kept some of the booty for himself from Jericho. And that leads to their defeat at the other town called Ai. You all know that story where Achan took some of the treasures and so on, and he buried them in his tent and led to defeat. And that leads Joshua and the children of Israel into seeking God's face And Achan is found out and he's punished. He and his family, they are killed, which then goes on, the story goes on to say that this allows them to have their victory over Ai. So, what's the purpose of telling this version of the story of the conquest in the exile? Why is it important that the Deuteronomist would be interested in this part of the history? Well, he has some things he wants to remind the children of Israel about, or the Israelites about. He wants them to understand that defeat is occasioned by disobedience. When we disobey, we are going to be led into defeat. But also, he wants them to realize that God is a faithful God and he will bring victory for his children when they are obedient to him. And so, what they should lead to is this thing of purification, repentance, and obedience. If and when they get out of the exile, they are to purify themselves to be once more totally dedicated as God's people. When we come to the book of Judges, we understand that this book starts after the death of Joshua and gives a totally different account of the conquest, because instead of wiping out the Canaanites, Israel is now living among the Canaanites, and they're the ones who really possess the land. Israel should have possessed it, but because of they didn't obey God, they are now running the problem with the people of the land of Canaan. At this time, we see a loose confederacy of tribes of Israel. There are 12 tribes. They understand that they are a part of one body, but they really kind of rule themselves. And in this time, judges, or a judge, a shophet, or a deliverer, or one who sets things right, or one who rules. The judge, who's a civilian or a military leader, he would be the one to come up and give Israel the kind of direction. So we see this cycle in the book of Judges around which the whole story of the book is developed. The cycle begins with this thing of apostasy. The people turn away from God, and this leads to oppression. God raises up an enemy to punish his people. Then this leads to them crying out for help. The people turn back to God. They cry out to him for mercy. They are repentant. And God responds by providing deliverance through the hand of a judge who comes and saves the people. But after a period of peace and rest, the people themselves again are given to apostasy, and the cycle begins again. And this goes on and on throughout the book of Judges. So, what is it all about? There are some Deuteronomists who believe that this, in the book of Judges and so on, is the problem of the land. First of all, we see land as gift. That is, God intended that his people who did not have a land, the people who lived in slavery in Egypt, that they would now receive a safe place to live. But the land as a gift was also a land as summons. They should have understood that living in land required them to respond to the gift of that land in a particular way, a way of obedience to God. Instead, the land became an item of seduction. The safety of living in the land induced them to see the land as property and not as a gift. So, as we'd say in modern day parlance, what the people end up doing is worshipping the gift instead of the giver. They didn't understand themselves as being the people of God and what that required, and they end up in problems. The books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, let's look at these. Indications of compiled literary traditions, that's repetition, contradiction, telescope stories, and so on, are evident in 1st and 2nd Samuel. We ought to remember that this is religious history and not modern history. They're not following the same canons of history as we do today. So in the book of First Samuel, we see the last judge, Samuel. He's not able to muster the military strength sufficient to overcome the Philistines. And in that story, we also see where the people of Israel, they clamor for a king because they see in Samuel a weak military leader. Okay? And so the book tells us about the transition from confederacy to monarchy. Israel is not just now a group of 12 loosely joined tribes. Instead, what we see is a rise of Israel as a nation with its kings. And there are two kings mentioned in these books, and the kings are Saul and then David. In 2 Samuel, it continues the story of David, which ends in 1 Kings chapter 1. One of the contradictions that scholars sometimes mention in the Deuteronomistic history is the opposing views of kingship in 1 Samuel. So first, for instance, there's this anti-monarchical kind of strain that we see in 8:1 to 22 and 10:17, 27, 12, 1 to 25. Where's this constant warning about Israel's clamoring for a king? And what the Samuel constantly is reminding them of is that a king is not going to be good for them. But then we start to see this pro-monarchical kind of move in the book also from 9:1 to 10:16 and 11:1 to 5, where the prophet is saying to the children of Israel, when it is the right time, God will give you a king, the king of his own choosing, who will not tax you, who will not send you out into unnecessary wars, and so on. Now, much of this kind of ambivalence in the minds of some comes from Deuteronomy 17:14 to 20, where we see in that time this warning coming from Moses that the people were to be very careful that when they got into the promised land, that they should not clamor after a king like the foreigners do, and they should definitely not have a foreign king. Now, earlier on, I hinted to a problem of this thing of the foreigners, and this is how we're going to see it coming in a way that we don't normally think of when we think of Saul, the first king. You see, Saul, the first king of Israel, is painted in a very, very unfortunate tragedy in the book of First Samuel. A tragedy in ancient literary traditions, a story that starts off low, it heightens, it increases seemingly the person increases in popularity, and then boom, they crash down at the end, in utter dismay. In many senses, the story of David is also a tragedy, but not in the sense as which the story of Saul is presented. So Saul is the king who comes to the throne, the unlikely king, the one who doesn't want to be king, the one who is chosen by the people because he's handsome, he's tall, and he's seen as being a great, person who the people want to lead them, into battles and so on. What we don't oftentimes remember is that Saul is likely the product of an illicit marriage that takes place back in Judges 19 through to 21, when the tribe of Benjamin was almost totally destroyed. And in order to repopulate the tribe, 300 or so women from foreign nations were taken away as slaves and given to the men. And there they were. That's how they repopulated the tribe of Benjamin. Now, there might be a suggestion that this is where Saul is coming from in terms of his semi devotion to God. He is devoted to God, but it's very questionable sometimes. He's given to all kinds of other practices and so on. So this is the man that Israel chooses a king. And during the war, Saul violates the boundaries of his office and he usurps the role of another. That is, in 1 Samuel 13, we are told about this thing, that he takes on the role of the priest when Samuel hasn't arrived in time to tell him as to whether or not he should go up against his enemies. And so, because he's impatient, he goes, and no sooner has he done this, that he has taken on the role of the priest that was forbidden, that then Samuel turns up and rebukes him. Then Saul tries to cover his error, okay, by demanding some inappropriate abstinence behavior during the war. 1 Samuel 14. You remember that? Saul is trying to make amends, and what he does is that he calls for a fast, a total fast. And guess what? One of his most important soldiers, that is Jonathan, knows nothing about it, and he breaks the fast. And suddenly you see where all of this is coming now at a head, because he's supposed to kill his son Jonathan. The problem wasn't the fact that he didn't kill him. The problem was that it was his error in trying to come to grips with the fact that he had strayed that has led him into serious problems. The great problem is compounded in 1 Samuel 15, when Samuel the prophet judges Saul for his abuse of power during the battle. That is when he takes his enemies, instead of again seeing them as harem that they should have been totally destroyed, he takes the best. He parades his enemy kings through the land of Israel, and they take the best of the sheep and so on. And Samuel rebukes him. And in that story, we are told that after the rebuke, Saul holds on to Samuel's robe and he tears the robe. And then Samuel says that that is a prophecy that the kingdom will be torn away from Saul, and God will replace him with someone who's after his own heart, after God's own heart. And that is where David comes in. We're not going to speak a whole lot about David here, except to say that David comes, and the rest of the story, okay, is devoted in 1 Samuel to this conflict between David and Saul. And then in 2 Samuel, we talk about David's life. David is not a perfect man, but a man after God's own heart is shown that when he makes mistakes, he is willing to constantly turn back to God, admit his fault, and move on. Saul was the totally opposite to that. So we come to 1st and 2nd Kings, and in the 1st and 2nd Kings, we see that Solomon comes, and after Solomon, the kingdom is divided into two nations. Not only was it torn away from Saul, but now we are seeing the division into two nations, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Israel's kings are universally bad. The northern kingdom is fraught with bad kings, while Judah's kings fluctuate between good and bad. In fact, the kings are always compared to David, but none surpass him. David is the greatest king, and the best kings of Judah are Hezekiah and Josiah. Do you know what makes them good kings? They are obedient to the law. The king's political gains, their military might, and all of those things, those are not used as signs of their goodness or badness. It is how faithful are they to the law. And in this regard, according to the Deuteronomist, none surpasses David, and the only two who might come close are Hezekiah and Josiah. So what's the significance of these theological interpretations of Deuteronomistic history? Let's review them as we move forward. Deuteronomy's centralization of worship and the blessing curse theology becomes very evident. We also see Joshua's ritualized conquest of the land, including sacrificial offering of enemies with the covenant renewal at the end as this thing of our total devotion. Everything we have must be given to God. We see Judges fourfold cyclical pattern again, reinforcing the idea that disobedience leads to destruction, obedience leads to deliverance and blessing. Interestingly, we see First Samuel's pro and anti-monarchical material, and I'm suggesting that it's really not as contradictory as people think, but what he's saying is that God wanted for Israel the right king, of whom David is. Saul is portrayed as a tragic figure throughout, as the stereotypical person who does not devote himself to God and so finds destruction. And we see First and Second Kings review of the kings of Israel and Judah, with the kings of Israel being all bad because they don't observe the law, the kings of Judah being mainly bad, but you have two good kings in Hezekiah and Josiah, and they are that way because they obey the law. How does Deuteronomistic history affect canonicity? Not all scholars agree with the theory of Deuteronomistic history. Okay, we have suggested that before. There are some who have rejected Knott's theory, but have proposed other multi-source theories, and we have conservatives largely who suggest that later Bible writers used Moses as a pattern and so wrote like him. So we don't need any theory like this to compound the problem of biblical authorship and raise questions that seem to diminish from the veracity of the book and the importance of it accepting it as being canonical. So, if Deuteronomistic history is to be accepted as true or as largely true, what are the implications for biblical canonicity? Does it really demean the value and the authority of the book, of the Bible? What I would say is that Israel at first saw these books as still being authoritative, and they compiled them into their canon without raising questions as to the value of the books. They saw behind them the tradition of Moses. And I still think that many people today can see the growing importance or development of these ideas. They haven't contradicted what went before, but they are only expounding and explaining some of the ideas that were nascent in the earlier books of the Bible. And so they are not in any way, shape, or form things that demean the value of biblical truth. I don't think it affects canonicity but I don't know what your thoughts are. Thanks for watching us being a part of this series.